His neuroscience studies of the effects of long-term meditation practice, including a long-standing collaboration with the Dalai Lama, have rocketed him to the elite ranks of scientific stardom. Richie has been leveraging this impact to develop initiatives capable of improving health at the societal level, including earning him accolades such as one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world in 2006, and service on the Global Council on Mental Health for the World Economic Forum. So it's a rare thing to become a leader in one field, let alone two, and even rarer to maintain conscientiousness, humble character, and a warm and approachable style. Yet this epitomizes my experiences with Richie. I first met Richie as a graduate student in 2005 through our common interest in identifying the impact of meditation on interoception. It was Richie's leadership in this area that inspired my confidence that pursuit of this question could represent a viable academic path forward, and for that I'm forever grateful, and I'm pleased to introduce to you Richie Davidson.
Thank you very much. Can people hear me? Okay, I'm going to wander a little. I'm glad we got the slides working, and it's really a pleasure for me to be here and to connect with Saeed and to see the really unique environment that you guys have here, really precious opportunity. And I very much look forward to seeing how this work unfolds at the Library Institute. And the facilities and the personnel are really stellar. So it's great to be here. Do I need to do something? Sorry. Okay. Better. Okay. Another title for this talk could be Well-Being as a Skill. It's often the title I use. And I hope to convince you of this by the end of my talk, that well-being actually should be regarded in the same way that we think about playing the violin, or the same way that we think about playing tennis. If you practice at it, you will get better. And that is the central message. And furthermore, the cultivation of well-being is, in my view, an urgent public health need. And each one of us need to step up to the plate and take responsibility, because our very nature of humanity and this planet depends on it at this moment in history. Okay, so I'm forced to have this slide as my second slide. I'm the founder, president, and I serve on the board of directors of a nonprofit organization that I started called Healthy Minds Innovations, for which I received zero money. I've never been paid a penny by it. And I also have served on the board of directors of the Mind and Life Institute, another nonprofit organization, for quite a long time. This is just an inspirational slide. The Dalai Lama has visited Madison, Wisconsin 16 times since he's been in exile. Actually, it's the largest number of times he's been to a city under 500,000 outside of India. We're very fortunate. He's become a very important figure in my life. This is a photograph taken in 2001 during one of his visits, where we were first showing him how functional MRI actually works. These were the early days of functional imaging. And he was asking lots of questions. And it was a wonderful opportunity to show him how these tools actually work. So there are a few key themes which underlie all this work. So I'm standing on the shoulders of giants whose work has absolutely been essential for the work that we do to unfold. And I'd like to very briefly name those themes and say a little bit about them in the early part of this talk. So these themes are, first is neuroplasticity, a word that I'm sure virtually everyone in this audience has heard before. And when we think about neuroplasticity, it's important to recognize that the brain is constantly changing, it's constantly being modified. by our experiences, by our environment. And the invitation here is that we can actually take more responsibility for our own brains. We can shape our brains intentionally, rather than leaving the shape of our brains willy-nilly to the forces around us. And that's really an important message. The second theme is very much parallel to this first theme in the realm of genomics, and this is epigenetics. We once had a very Newtonian view of genetics, that we had these predetermined set points and that basically development proceeded apace with little influence. We now know from the science of how genes are regulated that that view is wrong. And we know, for example, from hard-nosed neuroscientific research, that the way a mother behaves toward her offspring can induce epigenetic changes in the offspring which stick, which impact the behavior and experience of that offspring and modify brain structure and function and chemistry. So these findings are part of a growing corpus of work that suggests that the regulation of our genes also is under, at least in part, our voluntary control. And being able to transform our mind will have impact on the expression of our genes. And I'll show you some examples of empirical evidence consistent with that observation. The third theme is an increased understanding of the bidirectional communication between the mind, the brain, and the body. This is something Saeed is very interested in, as are we. And we're beginning to better understand how circuits in the brain influence the body and regulate physical health, and how circuits in the body can influence the brain. And so we know from large-scale epidemiological studies that people who report high levels of well-being are physically healthier. We don't understand fully what the mechanisms are, but if you look at large-scale epidemiological research, those data are quite robust. Probably the best evidence for that is in a series of studies that have come from the UK on British civil servants, the so-called Whitehall studies, where there's very good epidemiological evidence that people who report higher levels of well-being are physically healthy. And so this leads to the conjecture that if we cultivate well-being intentionally, it won't just affect our subjective well-being, it can actually have impact on our physical health. And if that's all true, it has the potential of actually reducing healthcare costs, which in this climate, in today's, in our country today, is such a salient issue. The fourth theme is probably the most controversial. And because of that, I'll spend a little bit more time on it. It's also one that I'm particularly excited about, and some may be surprised by the claim I'm about to make. But human beings are born with innate basic goodness. That is, we come into the world with a propensity to prefer warm-hearted, altruistic interactions compared to those that are selfish and aggressive. And it's not to say that the negative stuff isn't there, but it is to say that if an organism is given a choice, it will choose the pro-social alternative. So let me just, before I jump into the main heart of the talk, give you a little bit of evidence on a few of these points. So innate basic goodness. Now there's a whole series of studies in this genre. I'm just going to give you an example of one of them. This is a study where 6-month-old babies were exposed to the scenarios that I'm about to show you. These are 2 short video clips. Okay, that's the first video. Here's the second. Which of these do you think 6-month-old babies prefer? Of course, the first question is, how do you assess what a 6-month-old baby prefers? So the answer, of course, is the first one. You can assess preferences in the 6-month-old baby in a variety of ways. One is to hold up the puppets. They're color-coded, and I should tell you that in these studies, the color codes were randomized. So this is not an artifact of some color preference. 6-month-old babies will reach for the puppet that was cooperative much more than they will reach for the puppet that was not. Secondly, they smile more for the first one compared to the second one. And third, if you use infrared eye tracking to measure their duration of gaze, they look much longer at the first one compared to the second one. So the whole series of measures, and using also very different kinds of scenarios and stimuli, this finding has now been replicated several times. And it suggests that in early life, the vast majority of infants exhibit this pro-social bias, if you will, which leads us to the conjecture that there is such a thing as innate basic fitness. And so when we cultivate these qualities of mind, kindness and compassion, we're actually cultivating something that is already there in some elementary form. And the way we think about this is very much the way scientists think about language. We all come into the world with a biological predisposition for language. But in order for that predisposition to be expressed, we have to be raised in a normal linguistic community. There are case studies of feral children raised in the wild. They don't develop normal language. And so these seeds of kindness and compassion require nurturing to be cultivated. But they are there from the start, as these findings show. Now, a little bit about the epigenetic story. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but just to show you two examples. And these are from our own lab, where we've studied the extent to which acute epigenetic changes can be induced in long-term meditators through simple meditation practices. And so in this first study, we had participants come into the lab in the morning and spend a day of intensive practice meditating. We took blood samples in the morning and in the evening. And then we had controls who were age and gender matched come in for a day of leisure, where they had the same reduced physical activity, the same diet. They did exactly the same amount of walking during the day. And we also took blood samples before and after. And we were specifically looking at genes involved in the regulation of inflammation, because there's work suggesting that inflammatory processes may be impacted by these kinds of meditation. This is a whole story that we can talk about perhaps during questions and answers. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. But this is just a very quick overview of one of the key findings. RIPK2 is an important gene in the inflammatory cascade, and the red bars are the meditators. Time 1 is in the morning, time 2 is late in the afternoon, and the blue bar are the controls who come into the lab for a day of leisure. And you can see that there is a reduction in gene expression of this gene over the course of this very short period of time. And it turns out that this reduction is associated with cortisol recovery in the TSST, for those who know what I'm talking about. So this is a second study that we published just relatively recently, and this is using objective metrics of epigenetic aging. This is a way to estimate sort of cellular aging. It's a much more sensitive measure than telomere length. And we looked at whether epigenetic aging differed in long-term meditators and controls. And I won't bore you with the details, but I can just summarize. If you look at these plots in the middle, there are absolutely no differences between aging gender match controls and long-term meditators in their epigenetic aging. However, if you look at their years meditating, what you find is something quite interesting. Now, it turns out that some people have epigenetic aging which is proceeding more slowly compared to their chronological age, and for others, their epigenetic aging is proceeding more quickly compared to their chronological age. If you look at the meditators, those who have greater number of years of meditation are showing a slower rate of epigenetic aging. So those are what these plots were showing here. And we particularly see this in the women compared to the men. So these are just two little data bites on innate basic goodness and epigenetics to suggest that there's a lot more plasticity in these systems when it comes to epigenetics, and the innate basic goodness data suggest that we have these propensities from the start. So I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about the urgent need for this from a public health perspective and just share with you some data. So these are data that come from the 2019 World Happiness Report. If you look, I won't go through this in detail, but the blue bar here, the blue line, is North America. And if you look at happiness over the last 10 years, from 2006 to 2016, or 18 here, sorry, so the last 12 years, you can see that it's showing a gradual decline. Other parts of the world are not, although the trends are not great in many different parts of the world. If you look at the rankings of country, this is from the 2019 World Happiness Report, which is based on data from 2016 to 2018. If you look at the ranks of the countries, the United States is ranked number 19. It's fallen several places in terms of, now admittedly, this is not a particularly great metric of happiness. It's a single item, but it is very comprehensively administered to very large populations. Now, I want to show you another bit of data that's really revealing, and this is data showing changes in happiness over the 10-year period from 2005-8 to 2016-18 for every country that has been ranked, and I think there are 131 countries that have been ranked. And so when you see, when you see the bars going in this direction, it means their happiness is increasing, and they're ranked from the countries that show the biggest increase in happiness to those that are showing actual decreases in happiness. And I want to show you where the United States falls. So this is continuing down to 104, and here we have the United States. It's 112 out of 132 countries, so it's very, very close to the bottom in showing the largest declines in our national happiness compared to every other country in the world that has been studied using the identical metric. So we're just above South Africa, and we're below Zambia, Croatia, Madagascar, Laos, Ireland, and many, many, many other countries. Angus Deaton won the Nobel Prize in economics for this work. This is work showing for the very first time in US history, there is a decline in life expectancy among certain groups. This has never happened before in the United States history. This is the very first time that it's been documented. And what you see, looking here, you can see these figures. This is showing over the course of from 1990 to 2010, in virtually every other country in the world that's been looked at, there are declining death rates. This is deaths per 100,000 for white males in the United States. This is what the curve looks like. It's pretty astounding, and this just shows the cause of death, many different causes over this period of time. If you look at the percentage of youth, 12 to 17, who experienced major depression in the last year, looking at the longitudinal trajectory over the last decade, this is data from the Center for Disease Control. You can see that the trends don't look good. There is a rising percentage of youth, and this is for diagnosis of major depression. This is not just sort of mild dysphoria. And then if you look at the number of suicides, this is adolescent suicides. Over the course of this period, what you see again is an astounding rise. Over this period of time, which is 7 years, you see a more than doubling of the number of suicides in the US among adolescents. And so I hope that these data don't depress you too much, but they do show that this is really a public health issue, that things don't look so good. And what I would like to invite you to consider is that this problem, along with many other problems that we have, including the lack of civility in our country, or the increasing lack of civility, the rise of nationalism, the increase in bullying, the divisiveness that we see on the national scene, are all due to the same root cause. And that root cause is a failure of human flourishing, or we can say the lack of cultivating well-being. I want to read you a quote from a friend of mine. I'll show it to you in a second. Tom Insel, some of you know him, I know. Tom was the director of the National Institute of Mental Health for 13 years. He was the immediate former director of the NIMH, the largest funding agency in the world that funds psychiatric research. And this is a quote from Tom. It was in an interview that he had about 1 year ago. And I'd like to read you this quote. He said, "I spent 13 years at NIMH really pushing on the neuroscience and genetics of mental disorders. And when I look back on that, I realized that while I think I succeeded at getting lots of really cool papers published by cool scientists at fairly large costs, I think $20 billion, I don't think we moved the needle in reducing suicide, reducing hospitalizations, improving recovery for the tens of millions of people who have mental illness. I hold myself accountable for that." Very sobering. And Tom now is a great advocate of behavioral interventions that can change brain circuits in ways that are more specific than any kind of pharmacological intervention that we have today. And so this is a very important insight from someone who is really on the inside. Okay, so what do I mean by well-being? And how can it be cultivated? So the rest of my talk, I'm going to tell you about a framework that is now something that is a major centerpiece of a lot of what we're doing in different parts of our center. This is a framework that informs much of what we're doing. And this is a framework that is derived equally from our knowledge of current scientific evidence, as well as traditions which take as a premise that well-being can be learned. And so it represents the intersection of what we know from science and what we know from these ancient traditions about the cultivation of well-being. So what are the four components or four pillars of well-being? The first is awareness. Now, you will not find, at least we haven't found, any other account in scientific research where awareness has been considered a constituent of well-being. But we believe that it's super important, and it includes basic mechanisms of attention and of meta-awareness in particular. Meta-awareness is something that psychologists and neuroscientists are studying now, and meta-awareness is knowing what your mind is doing. Now, how many of you think that you know what your mind is doing? Probably many of you think it's a crazy question. And yet, if you really honestly reflect on the details of your life, all of us have had the experience of not knowing what our mind is doing. How many of you have had the experience, I know I have, of reading a book where we're reading words on a page, and you read a page, you may read another page, and after a couple of pages you have no friggin' idea what you've just read. Your mind is somewhere else. That is an example of not knowing what your mind is doing. And so neuroscientists have been studying this and have identified circuits in the brain that are really important in monitoring what the rest of the brain is doing. And so this is something crucial, we believe. And we would go so far as to say that meta-awareness is a necessary condition for any kind of personal transformation. If you don't have meta-awareness, you cannot transform. So more about that later. Second component of well-being is connection. And by connection, we're talking about the qualities that facilitate successful, harmonious, interpersonal, and social relationships. Qualities like kindness, empathy, maintaining a positive outlook. The third component we call insight, and this is about self-knowledge. We all have a narrative that we tell about ourselves. And some people, at the extreme of the distribution, have a lot of negative self-beliefs, and they actually hold those beliefs to be a true description of who they are. And of course, that is a prescription for depression. So part of well-being is developing a healthy relationship to this narrative. It's not so much about changing the narrative. It's not so much about getting rid of the narrative. The narrative is what our minds do, and there are parts of our brain that are importantly involved in this, but well-being entails self-knowledge in the sense of changing our relationship to the narrative and understanding what the narrative is. And what the narrative is really a constellation of thoughts. And finally, the last pillar of well-being is purpose. Having a clear sense that your life is headed in a particular direction, a sense of meaning, and most importantly, that our everyday tasks, our everyday activities are aligned with our sense of purpose. So can you envision your life such that washing the dishes or taking out the garbage is actually part of your sense of purpose? It's all part of the direction your life is headed. So those are the 4 pillars of well-being. So now I'm going to take a deeper dive and show you a little bit more about each in the time that I have remaining. So the dude on the right is one of my favorite figures in the American Academy, and that is a picture of William James, who said this in 1890 in his book, The Principles of Psychology. The faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. No one is compos sui if he have it not. An education which should improve this faculty would be the education par excellence. But it is easier to define this ideal than to give practical directions for bringing it about. The italics are in the original William James. This is an amazing quote. This comes from his chapter on attention in the Principles of Psychology.
And William James had the intuition that educating attention was so important. And if he had contact with the contemplative traditions, more contact, he would have seen that if nothing else, these were technologies for educating attention. So important. Okay, now there was a study done a number of years ago that was published in Science, which is a very prestigious scientific journal. It was done by a bunch of social psychologists at Harvard, and they took advantage of the fact that we all carry around smartphones these days. And so it used a strategy that has been called experience sampling or ecological momentary assessment, where people are essentially texted at different points throughout their day, and they're asked a few brief questions. And this was done in several thousand people. And they're asked essentially 3 questions. First question, what are you doing right now? And the people had to check off from a list of activities. The second question they're asked is, where is your mind right now? Is it focused on what you're doing, or is it focused elsewhere? And the third question is, right at this moment, how happy or unhappy are you right now? So this is what they found. The average American adult spends 47% of her or his waking life not paying attention to what they're doing. 47% of the time. The title of this paper was "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind." When people's minds were wandering, they reported systematically less happiness than when their minds were focused, even if what they were doing was boring, even if what they were doing was something like washing the dishes. Being distracted is toxic for our well-being. And there is a documented, empirically validated increase in distractibility in our culture today. Of course, we don't know exactly the reasons for it, but I think it's a fair assumption that the advent of digital devices has had something to do with it. So this is really important. We've studied the capacity of meditation to alter attentional circuits in the brain over many years, along with many other scientists. And I'll just give you a couple of small tidbits of data. This is a picture of one of our very long-term practitioners. This is actually a very famous Tibetan monk by the name of Mingyur Rinpoche, who has been studied in our lab on multiple occasions. He's had, at the time we tested him, which was in this picture many years ago, he had an average lifetime practice of 62,000 hours of formal practice. You can go do the arithmetic at home, but 62,000 hours for someone who was in his 30s at the time is a crazy number. Basically, he's a professional meditator, and so we started with people like him to see if their brains were different, because if we didn't see any signals in these people's brains that were different from ordinary people, then studying beginners would be sort of pointless. So that's why we began with these practitioners. And in the first paper we published with these practitioners, which was published in 2004, Antoine Lutz was the first author, who was a postdoc in my lab at the time. What we observed are these high amplitude gamma oscillations during meditation. And this effect was so large that when we first published the paper, we actually didn't fully appreciate that there was another finding in the paper that may ultimately be of much more significance. And that is that their baseline levels of gamma, before they started meditating, were also significantly higher than in controls. So these gamma oscillations, we think, may be an important signature and reflect some aspects of what may be going on during these meditation practices. More recently, I just decided to throw in a little very recent finding. This is with very short-term meditators. This is people who underwent 8 weeks of mindfulness-based stress reduction, the 8-week program developed by John Kabat-Zinn. We compared them to actually 2 groups, a waitlist control group as well as an active control group. I don't have the data for the active control group up here, but it resembles the waitlist group. And this is a specific task that is a well-validated task to measure different aspects of attention. It's a flanker task for those who know about this stuff. I don't want to spend a lot of time on the details, but suffice it to say that we found a behavioral finding where the meditators just after 8 weeks showed a reduction in reaction time that reflected an improvement in certain aspects of attention compared to the control groups. And this reduction in reaction time was correlated with changes in white matter that we measured with diffusion-weighted imaging. This is looking at the pathway in the pathway that borders on the internal capsule, and it's important pathway in attention that connects connects different parts of the brain that are implicated in attention, particularly prefrontal and parietal cortices. And what we saw is that this change in reaction time among the meditators was correlated with changes in white matter that we measured with the diffusion-weighted imaging, suggesting that you can see structural changes in the brain after a very short amount of time. The average length of time of practice that we're talking about here with mindfulness-based stress reduction is around 24 to 30 hours of total practice. And so what you see are changes both on objective behavioral measures and on imaging measures. So I want to say a little bit about connection and show you another set of data from, again, a very short-term study that's really a kind of proof of concept study where we asked the question whether 2 weeks of compassion training was sufficient to change the brain and behavior among people who've never meditated before. Now, what is compassion training for those who've never done this sort of thing? And I'll just tell you very briefly. The way this works is a person is asked to start with visualizing a loved one. So it could be a family member, it could be a very close friend, it could even be a pet. And imagine a time in their life when they may have been suffering. And bring that person into your mind and your heart and cultivate the genuine aspiration that they be relieved of that suffering. And you can use a simple phrase that you repeat to yourself like, may you be happy and free of suffering. Something very simple like that. And they do that for a loved one, they do that for themselves. Then they do it for a category of persons that we call a stranger. A stranger is someone whose face you recognize, but you don't know a lot about their lives. Now, all of us have people that we see on a regular basis. It could be people that work in the same building that you work in. It could be people that are in the same class that you're in. It could be a cashier at a grocery store that you frequent. There are people in our lives who we can recognize their face, but we really don't know much about them. We call them strangers for this purpose. And we can bring them into our heart. And even if we don't know whether they've ever had a tragedy or they've been suffering, just imagine that they might have been and cultivate the aspiration that they be happy and free of suffering. And then finally, we move on to a category of person that some meditation teachers say that 1 hour of practice with this category is worth 100 hours of practice with all the rest. And that is, we bring into our mind and our heart a difficult person, someone who pushes our buttons. Now, not necessarily the most difficult person, but we begin with someone who we have some difficulty with. And we do the same thing. We bring them in a very genuine way into our mind and our heart with a true aspiration that they be happy and free of suffering. And you do this each day for 30 minutes. And what we did is we scanned people before and after they went through this 2 weeks of training. And we had a control group that was randomly assigned to either the compassion group or the control group. And the control group did the same amount of mental exercise that was derived from cognitive therapy, where they were trained to reappraise negative events in a more positive way. So one of the tasks that we give them at the end is an economic decision-making task where we can measure altruistic behavior. And this is favored by behavioral and neuroeconomists, these kinds of tasks, because it provides a kind of objective, a hard-nosed metric of a person's willingness, in this case, to spend real money. So we paid the subjects to participate in the experiment, and they're giving up real money that we are going to give them to render a third-party transaction to be more fair. That was the task in this case. And so what we find is that the folks in the compassion group behave more altruistically compared to those who were getting reappraisal training, and circuits in their brain changed. And I won't go into all the details now, but specifically connectivity between areas of the prefrontal cortex and the ventral striatum, which is important for certain kinds of positive emotions, was strengthened. And the magnitude of changes in the brain predicted the extent to which they behaved altruistically. And so this is just a proof of concept to show that these changes can happen. Much more recently, and of real urgent relevance to our national scene, is implicit bias. And I want to just share one little tidbit of data. This is very recent data, not yet published. But educators are very concerned about the achievement gap in the United States, the achievement gap between blacks and whites. And there's good evidence to suggest that this achievement gap is heavily driven by a discipline gap. And the discipline gap is the administration of harsh and punitive punishment disproportionately to members of racial and ethnic minorities. And there's very good evidence for this. And this discipline gap is primarily driven by implicit bias. And so we asked whether we can actually reduce implicit bias. And this is a behavioral measure of bias. It's not asking a person, are you biased on a questionnaire? Those measures are pretty much worthless. This is a behavioral measure of implicit bias. And so this was an intervention that combined elements of mindfulness and kindness. So it's not just a mindfulness intervention, despite the label on this slide. So this is the behavioral measure of implicit bias. This is among teachers who are just in their last 6 months of training before they go out into the teaching profession. And what we see is a reduction in implicit bias that is preserved at 6-month follow-up compared to a control group. So we think that these are data that have important policy implications. Now let me show you another bit of data that we're really excited about as well. Over the years, we've been studying a lot of long-term meditators, and we routinely just take pictures of them, photographs, just part of our files. We ask them to stand there, please take a picture. We take a picture of all participants. And so we have this pool of photographs of long-term meditators and age and gender match controls. And what we decided recently is, wow, we can really examine these. Let's give these photographs. Of course, we had participants' permission to use them in scientific research. We gave these photographs to random people and just asked them to rate these photographs on qualities like, how neurotic does this person look? How mindful does this person look? How agreeable? And they had no idea that these photographs came from meditators and non-meditators. So we gave these photographs to hundreds of other people, and here's what we found. But before I show you the data, I want to just give you a few examples. Which is the meditator, left or right? Quick. Right. How many say right? Okay. Which is the meditator, left or right? I didn't make this stuff up. These are real stimuli, these are real photographs from this study. If you look at the findings, LTM stands for long-term meditator. These are the controls. And we asked them to rate on these dimensions: agreeableness, comfortableness, conscientiousness, mindful, and neurotic. And what you can see is that the long-term meditators are rated as significantly more comfortable, more conscientious, more mindful, and less neurotic than their age and gender matched counterparts. So there's something in the face that is conveying these signals. And we're really excited about it because we think we can harness information in the face to make passive inferences about a person's well-being. And the average person, all of you have these devices somewhere on you. And if you have one of these modern devices, it opens with a photograph. And the average person opens their phone in the US approximately 200 times a day. So that provides very rich data which potentially can be mined for these elements of well-being. So this is, at the very early stages, but we're very excited about this possibility. So let me say a little bit about insight and purpose in the last 4 minutes. I'm going to just really run through this. This issue of stickiness is really important. Now, what do we mean by stickiness? We think of resilience, in fact, we define resilience as the rapidity with which you recover from adversity. The rapidity with which you recover from adversity. People who recover quickly are more resilient. So we can hypothetically illustrate that. Imagine a stress happens at time point 3 here, and I've drawn one curve, and let me show you a second curve, a hypothetical curve of another person, and you can see they reach the same amplitude of response, but person B recovers more quickly. We think that there's a huge amount of information in the rapidity with which you recover. And this is a learnable skill. You can learn to become more resilient. This is a study that just recently came out in Neuroimage from our group, looking at connectivity between the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the amygdala in long-term meditators and in MMPs. It stands for meditation naive participants, age and gender matched. And this is a very large sample, and we see differences in connectivity in this circuit, which is related to the rapidity with which they recover from adversity on other measures. So we think that this is really important, and we also show that there are changes in these circuits that can be induced through this kind of practice. A few years before that, we published a study in very long-term meditators in response to physical pain. This was heat, and I won't go through the details in this, but heat it's real heat, it's very realistic pain. I've done this to myself many times. It really hurts, but we can deliver it in a way which is safe. And so the experiment simply consisted of having a warning signal where we warn people that they're going to get zapped in a few seconds. And then we look at their response in networks in the brain that we know are pain-relevant networks. And so among non-meditators, what you see is when they get the warning cue, which is here, they begin to elevate activation in their pain matrix immediately, even though nothing happened. They got a tone signaling that the painful stimulus is about to come on. And they keep elevating when the painful stimulus comes on, and then in the recovery period, they remain elevated, and it takes them a long time to recover. Among the long-term meditators, we see a very different pattern. When the warning cue comes on, nothing happens in the pain matrix. We don't see any significant change in any region of the pain matrix. When the pain comes on, we see a huge response. And in certain areas of the brain, it's actually significantly larger than in non-meditators. And then we see a very rapid recovery. That is the signature of resilience. That is the neural signature of resilience. Showing a strong response when it's appropriate, and then rapidly coming back to baseline. And this is something that can be catalyzed and cultivated through training. Okay, I'm just going to end very, very briefly and just show you that purpose is the single most important psychological predictor of longevity in people who are in their 70s and 80s. This is one of several studies of its kind, and it's just comparing people who are in the 90th percentile on a measure of sense of purpose compared to people who are in the 10th percentile. And what is being displayed is the hazard ratio for death, quite a potent dependent measure. And what you can see is that among those who are in the highest 10%, the 90th percentile of sense of purpose, they're dying much more slowly compared to those who are in the 10th percentile who are dying more quickly. And so purpose, we think, is another really important one, and there are specific meditation practices that are designed to highlight and to catalyze, if you will, one's sense of purpose. So I'm going to end here, and I'm going to end with a quote that's one of my favorite quotes. This was from a book the Dalai Lama wrote that was on the bestseller list for quite some time, called The Art of Happiness. And he said, "The systematic training of the mind, the cultivation of happiness, the genuine inner transformation, by deliberately selecting and focusing on positive mental states and challenging negative mental states, is possible because of the very structure and function of the brain. But the wiring in our brains is not static, not irrevocably fixed. Our brains are also adaptable." So thank you very much.
Maybe you have time for a couple questions. I know we got started a little bit late, but anybody have any questions?
In the data in general, but I'll take that last bit of resilience response as an example. How necessary is meditation in order to have the resilient response? Were there controls that sort of naturally have this resilient response?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you for asking it. And the answer is yes. There are some people who, for reasons that we don't fully understand, show up and are highly resilient to begin with, and who have not been doing anything intentional to train their mind. And so there's big individual differences in these parameters. Absolutely. So, it may be that there are a small group of people who, for complex reasons, are very resilient to begin with, and they don't need to waste their time meditating. But for the rest of us, we need to put our butts on the cushion because it clearly helps. So, yeah.
Or if there are changes in media, the internet, and things, that these having an effect on our distractibility, or?
Yeah, I mean, there's very good evidence to suggest, at least to suggest, that media plays a role in increasing our distractibility. There are data, for example, that where adolescents today have been tested on the identical objective measures of attention that same-age adolescents were tested 30 years ago, before any digital devices were present. So on the identical measures, looking at large samples. And the data clearly show that adolescents today perform worse than adolescents 30 years ago on the identical measures. And the inference, of course, we can't prove from that kind of study that it is caused by digital devices, but I think most people would agree that they play some role.
So I'll just take the last question, then we'll end for time purposes. But I'm really curious to get your thoughts in terms of, so we're a mental health hospital and a research facility. We focus on studying people with psychiatric disorders for the most part, or who've experienced severe trauma. And what are your thoughts and kind of guidance in terms of the role of contemplative practices and training in individuals who have clinical disorders, mental health disorders in particular?
Yeah, so I appreciate the question, Saeed. It's really an important question, and I'll say a few things about it. First, it's important to recognize that meditation evolved over the last 2,500 years not to treat illness. The purpose of meditation is not to treat illness. It is to promote awakening, to promote well-being, to promote human flourishing. And so it is a distinctly modern decision to explore the possibility that these techniques can be used to actually treat illness. This is something that has only happened in the last 15 years. Before that, really, there's very little that existed in this area. And I would say that the empirical evidence for anxiety and depression suggests that mindfulness-based interventions, particularly mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, can be useful among patients with clinical diagnosable anxiety and mood disorders. But they're no more effective than any other kind of empirically validated treatment. And so anyone who tells you that they're more effective than any other empirically validated treatment is way exaggerating the evidence, in my view. However, they are comparable to some of the best examined empirically validated treatments. So and the other thing I always say to people who ask about this is that it's important not to undertake the practice of meditation by someone who has a diagnosable psychiatric disorder without a mental health professional who also is experienced in meditation kind of supervising it. And because it could be dangerous. And there are reports in the scientific literature of potentially negative side effects particularly among patients with histories of psychiatric illness who try different kinds of meditation and who actually have found there are reports of exacerbating the symptoms rather than helping. And so I think it needs to be approached in a careful way. And there may be certain patients who would be particularly drawn to these kinds of techniques who would really benefit, and there may be others who wouldn't benefit. And so I think there's still a lot to learn from it, about it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.